Hello, and welcome to today's FP Virtual Dialogue. With today's event, we are delighted to celebrate the 2021 Gelber Prize winners, the authors of Trade Wars Are Class Wars: How Rising Inequality Distorts the Global Economy and Threatens International Peace. The authors Matthew Klein and Michael Pettis are both with us today. And I think it will be an illuminating conversation and also an engaging dialogue with the audience. It should be a fascinating discussion about global economic imbalances, what's really driving them, what it means for the world, and what can be done about them. My name is Cameron Abadi. I'm a deputy editor of Foreign Policy magazine. I was also pleased to be on the jury for the Gelber Prize this year. The Gelber Prize, for those not familiar with it, is awarded every year to the world's best nonfiction book in English on foreign affairs. The book that's selected is selected for its overall quality, but more than that, it's selected for its success at really deepening public debate, at engaging readers on issues that have public significance and relevance at the current moment. And this year's winner definitely qualifies under all those criteria. The prize is presented in partnership with the University of Toronto's Monk's School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and also Foreign Policy magazine. So thank you all for tuning in. And a big thanks, of course, to the Monk's School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto for helping us make this event possible today. So before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. We want to make sure that we can hear from the audience. We have hundreds of people tuning in from around the world, over 1,000 in fact. That's in addition to our live streams and social media, and a significant portion of the event will be devoted to questions coming from the audience. That poses the question of how to raise those questions. So the way to do that is, if you're dialing in on Zoom, you should see a Q&A button below. If you click on that, you can submit questions that way. We just ask that you be sure to tell us your name and where you're writing from. Otherwise, if you're joining us by phone or if you're watching the live stream, you can email us your questions. The address for that is events@foreignpolicy.com. Again, that's events@foreignpolicy.com, and we'll receive those emails and cycle through the questions that way. Of course, we also encourage you to engage online. If you're on social media, just be sure to use the hashtag Gelber Prize. Okay, so let's get started. With that, I would be delighted, I am delighted now to introduce our first speaker. That is Janice Stein, who is the jury chair of the Lionel Gelber Prize. Janice is also the Belzberg Professor of Conflict Management in the Department of Political Science and the founding director of the Monk's School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. She's a prolific TV commentator and chair of the Research Advisory Board to the Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister. Janice, welcome to the program.
So nice to see you, Cameron. Cameron was on our jury, and wonderful to talk about the 5 shortlisted books, and of course to have Michael and Matthew with us for a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. This has now been my second year on the jury, and again, was so happy to see such an amazing book win the award this year, but also was so pleased or interested to see the kind of the the group of books it emerged from. There was a short list of 5 books that I had the pleasure of judging on the jury, and that I imagine came from a much longer list of books that came out over the course of the year. But the 5 that it got narrowed down to, I think it's a testimony to the award of how diverse they were.
That's right.
Could you give a sketch? If you recall all of the books, I'm
I
happy to pitch
do,
in.
Cameron, because they were all so interesting to read. And as you said at the beginning, the Lionel Gelber Prize is really devoted to a book that deals with an important issue, but does so in a way that the informed reader without any specialization can understand and appreciate and engage with and argue with. That's very much in the spirit of the man himself who started this prize. He wanted engagement around important international issues. So we have 5 of them. The first is Peter Andreas's book, Killer High. Now, what a great title for a book, frankly. I was eager to read the book as soon as I read that title. But this is a really gripping look at war by looking at the drugs that characterize different phases of war. And it goes from tobacco to caffeine to opium to getting high on amphetamine and cocaine. And it just made me think entirely differently about war and about the experience that soldiers had. This is a really wonderful book to read. Anne Applebaum, a former Gelber winner, her book is on the list as well, Twilight of Democracy. It's a very poignant, personal reflection by Anne of what has happened in democracy to Eastern Europe. In talking to her about this book, I asked her why she started it with a vivid story of a dinner party. And she said, well, that was the beginning of this rapid change in the fate of democracy in Eastern Europe. And it's a fate that, frankly, all of us have an interest in and should be engaged with. Charles Kupchan's book, Isolation, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World, situates what may have felt to some of us, especially those outside the United States, Cameron, it may have felt like the years from 2016 to 2020 were anomalies, but Charles goes way back in American history and writes a very vivid history of isolation as it runs through American foreign policy and shows us why this is a recurring theme in American foreign policy, not a one-off, and always with consequences for the world around us. And finally, Margaret Macmillan's absolutely wonderful book, War, How Conflict Shaped Us. Margaret starts her book very, very early on in history and does a wonderful job, Cameron, of showing us how war shapes our society, how war shapes culture, how war shapes women, and the opportunities that it creates actually for women to leave home and move out into the larger economy and larger society when countries are at war. So 4 absolutely great books that the Lionel Gelber Prize and the Monk School in Foreign Policy I encourage you to read. Of course, the 5th is Trade Wars Are Class Wars, and the 2 authors are with you. So I'm not going to say too much about that, Cameron, other than to say This book got the jury sitting upright in its seats. Our discussion about it really underpinned how this shifted our lens on trade. You know, most of us think of trade as something that governments do with other governments. That this book demolishes that view and makes us understand the deeply domestic roots of trade and its deeply domestic consequences. We're very proud that Trade Wars Are Class Wars is our 2021 winner of the Lionel Gelber Prize.
Yeah, so as you've all just heard, the spectrum of books this year ranged from drugs like cocaine and heroin and their relationship to war, to populism, to the history of war more generally, to American history and its its relationship to the rest of the world. And in some ways, the winner of the Prize seems at least superficially may seem like the least likely, or seems to stand out as the subject maybe that is least traditionally a foreign policy subject rather than a strictly economic subject. But I agree, Janice, that one of the, I think, great benefits of the book is the way it shows that it's impossible to separate these subjects. This is trade is a foreign policy subject. It's also a domestic subject, and so I think it's instructive that the book won this year's prize as well in that way.
It certainly isn't, and I think, Cameron, you make such an important point for all the readers of foreign policy and people who love big books about global affairs and global ideas. That boundary is gone. What happens in the world affects almost all of us at home, and what happens at home changes the world.
Well, Janice, thank you so much for being with us and setting the stage for the discussion today.
Looking forward to it.
And for more generally, fantastic. So I suppose with that, we should move on to the next segment, which features our two award-winning authors. You've heard their names already. They're Michael Pettis and Matthew Klein. I'll start with Michael. Michael Pettis is a professor of finance at Peking University's Guangzhou School of Management. He's a senior fellow for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Matthew Klein is the economics commentator at Barron's. He previously wrote on economics and finance for the Financial Times Alphaville blog and co-hosted the AlphaCast podcast, and he's worked for Bloomberg View and The Economist. Michael, Matthew, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
So we've heard in very, very broad strokes about your book. I'll just start by saying it's a book with a very provocative thesis. It's a wealth of evidence and political relevance, probably in ways that you didn't anticipate when you wrote the book. It came out before the start of the pandemic, which has brought all sorts of themes from the book, I think, to new light. But before we get into that, I think all of our listeners would benefit from hearing some broad sketch of the basic outlines of the argument. And it struck me that maybe one way of starting that conversation is with the title itself. It is, again, Trade Wars Are Class Wars. And that phrase, trade wars, is something that we heard a lot about in recent years with the Trump administration and tensions with China. There was obviously confrontation over trade. There was talk of exiting the TPP agreement, revisions to NAFTA. All of this may be familiar to people reading the news, but I think one of the things your book does is shows that in some ways those things we talk about in trade wars are on the surface of trade, and really underneath these trade wars is a much kind of deeper system that is linked to domestic politics as well. could you give a sketch of yeah, the kind of deeper background of the trade wars beyond the kind of fireworks of individual trade agreements?
Maybe I should start, Matt. I think what we were really trying to do in this book, Cameron, I think we were both very dissatisfied with much of the discussion on trade, because that's based on an idea of trade that I think is fairly obsolete. I think 100 years ago, 150 years ago, trade was quite different. Transportation costs were very high, communication costs were very high. There was an awful lot more friction towards trade. And at the time, trade imbalances generally reflected imbalances in, or not so much imbalances, but differences in the cost of production. So England was able to produce textiles more cheaply than France, so it sold textiles to France, and it ran a trade surplus with France. That's the way it worked back then. It was really, the key issue was the fact that a country, in this case England, was able to produce something much more cheaply than its trade partners, and the trade imbalances emerged from that. We know that the trade account and the capital account always balances, and so a corollary to that was that the capital account then adjusted in order to balance with the trade account. And the way that happened, for example, is if England runs a trade surplus with France, then either France ships gold to England, and so you get the balance in the capital account, or English banks lend money to French importers through French banks, and you get the shift in the capital account that way. And the point we wanted to make in our book is that we live in a very, very different trading environment. And that's no longer how trade works, and that's no longer what causes trade imbalances. In the first chapter, for example, we spent a lot of time talking about what happened to transportation and communication costs. And as you know, they've basically collapsed almost to zero. It costs nothing to transport something to the other side of the world. It costs very, very little. So without frictional costs, that changes very much the nature of trade, because now it makes a lot of sense to ship goods around for tiny incremental advantages. But more importantly, what we argue in this book is that what causes trade imbalances is no longer differential production costs. China doesn't run a surplus with the US because China is more efficient at producing stuff than the US is. What we argue is that the imbalances are generated really by distortions in the distribution of income. So, for example, to use maybe a less loaded set of examples, Germany within Europe, we often think that countries with low wages have an advantage in trade.
So we're getting a bit of
that's not true. What matters is the relationship. Germany is the most productive country in most other European countries. However, wages is less than the gap between productivity. The example that I use is that German workers' productivity is
So Matthew, I think we're getting a bit of turbulence on Michael's feed. So perhaps we could even specify even a bit more in terms of the argument. I think one of the things that the book does is sort of show that the global trading system is itself kind of based on various domestic political economic models, and that the models, those individual economic models are themselves linked together to create the kind of global system. So the three countries the book focuses on, I think, are all very illuminating. They're China and Germany and the United States. And I think all of them are come under new light. I think Germany, I think, was one of the more surprising chapters of the book. It struck me that it came under pretty severe criticism for the kind of domestic economic model it has created and the way that is feeding into the kind of international trade imbalances that Michael was just talking about. So can you sketch the kind of German domestic political economic system that has helped create these international economic problems?
Sure. So the sort of starting point that I think a lot of people have, and this is something that Michael was getting at, is that people assume that the reason why Germany as a country has such a large trade surplus with the rest of the world is because Germans are so much more productive and so much more thrifty and efficient. And our point is that that's not at all correct. I mean, this sort of reward you should be getting for being a more effective producer of exports is that you can import more stuff. That's the reason why you want to export things of higher quality and sell them for higher prices, that you can then get things from the rest of the world that are better. If you have a trade surplus, it means you're importing relatively less than you're exporting. And the reason why this has happened in Germany, as the reason it happens in a lot of other places, is that people within Germany, consumers and businesses and the government, are all spending relatively less than they're earning, and that this in particular is not caused because people are just naturally thrifty. The household savings rate in Germany is not particularly high compared to, say, Italy or Belgium or a lot of other European countries. The reason is because the distribution of income has become increasingly skewed, and purchasing power has been shifted away from people who actually like to buy goods and services, therefore creating jobs and incomes for people in the rest of the world, and instead has been redirected towards the very, very rich and the companies that they control. And this has been exacerbated over the past 20 years or so by changes in German government policy, both at the federal and the state levels, of essentially focusing sort of myopically on the goal of having balanced budgets or even budget surpluses, and achieving that through a mixture of tax increases on workers and spending cuts, particularly on public investment and on social welfare programs, which is, the net effect has been to just squeeze overall spending within Germany such that import demand has been suppressed. And so if you look at the data, one thing that's really striking is that, the period when the surplus has been rising so much is not been due to growth of exports particularly fast. Export growth in Germany over the past 20 years has not been fast. It's just that import growth has been extremely, extremely, and that is what's been driving the trade surplus. And unfortunately, that's ended up having a lot of consequences for Germany's neighbors and the rest of the world.
So to clarify, that is the class war part of the title. That in a country like Germany, this success at exporting is related to decisions that have been made to spend less at home, to have less money in German people's pockets, and that creates an ability to export more.
I would phrase
that
even slightly differently, which is it's not success at exporting; it's really a failure at importing. That German exports really didn't actually, do anything particularly remarkable relative to what it was before. It's rather that that didn't translate into what would normally happen and what had happened in the past, which was then higher consumer spending and higher business investment. And there are a lot of sort of specific reasons why that happened when it did. We sort of trace that history in the book, but I mean, that's really the sort of key thing here. That's not about, I mean, I have nothing against German manufacturing. I mean, I have a meal vacuum and it works wonderfully, but that's not the reason why Germany has, it produces 10% more than it consumes as an economy. Those are sort of two different things. And if you want to, getting at that, you have to look at the changes in the distribution of income and essentially, as I said, these class politics. I mean, that's why we put that in the title.
So that is, so a few questions come to mind. And again, this is sort of using Germany then as to illuminate some of the broader questions. Are you saying then that the lack of domestic spending and the lack of income redistribution is not contributing at all? It's not really, it's even like kind of, it's not playing a role in this? Is competitiveness, that word that people always use, is that not a real factor in at all in success at exports, at least
So
in Germany's case? So,
if it were, it might be because, the wage costs of German exporters were held down and that would lower the prices. But I mean, the counter argument here is that sort of the classic case that people in Europe talk about as an uncompetitive country where things did not go well would be Spain over the same period. And in Spain, you did have a very large increase in the trade deficit that sort of counterbalanced in Germany. And, we talk about the interaction there a bit in the book, but Spanish exports did very well during this period. Spain is still a major manufacturing power. It was a very different story from, say, what happened in the United States, for example. And so even though you did have what people describe as a decline in competitiveness that showed up in the overall trade balance in Spain, this wasn't actually showing up as anything bad on the volume of Spanish exports, the quality of Spanish exports. So I think we should be very careful about making that kind of attribution.
so I want to move on soon to the United States as the other example that you discuss in detail. But then just one final question, I think, on Germany, which is if I happen to live in Germany, and often I encounter the argument that basically amounts to saying, well, this model, this political economic model that we have, maybe we don't get paid as much as we would in other countries. Maybe we're not as wealthy. Normal consumers aren't as wealthy, but the system is stable, the jobs are stable, and that's really what Germans want out of the system. In other words, so the term class war is, I think, an interesting term. It's a sort of, I don't know, it's a sort of polemical term, but is there something like inherently? Yeah, is it inherently repressive to Germans, or because they are consenting to this, and they are it's a product of democratic policies that have produced this. So is there something incoherent in the system or inherently repressive, or is this a coherent model that may just work for Germans if they like it this way?
So this is where I think the historical context is helpful. And I don't know how much detail you want to get into on this, but I mean, we talk about it a lot in the book, but a lot of what sort of exists now and emerged over the past sort of 15, 20 years was a response to the turmoil of the 1990s and, the collapse of East Germany and its absorption and all of that. And, from that perspective, yes, the situation as it has evolved, you can see what the appeal is. But at the same time, I would not say that. I mean, we should be careful of saying, oh, this is a much more stable system and so forth. I mean, a lot of the changes that occurred in the early 2000s led to things like an increase in the poverty rate. You had the fact that employment has gone up is mostly because people who are on the verge of taking early retirement, people in their sort of late 50s, early 60s, and would have just essentially gone on unemployment benefits until they collected Social Security, instead were sort of forced into taking these low-paid part-time jobs, and so that mechanically reduces the observed unemployment rate and improves the government budget balance because you have people paying Social Security taxes as opposed to collecting benefits. But overall household purchasing power actually isn't going up in that scenario. In fact, it might go down. So I mean, maybe there's, to use a term, maybe people aren't really, false consciousness or whatever. I don't want to, the understanding what people are thinking. That's not really my area. But I mean, you're looking at just sort of the data of what happened. I mean, that's not a situation where there was an increase in stability. Maybe compared to what was going on in sort of the mid 1990s, you could say there was an increase in stability, but not compared to the world before that.
So I do want to shift to the
Cameron,
Yes.
Can I add something to that? Can you hear me? By the way. Okay, I turn off my video because hopefully that'll improve the sound. But there's something else that I want to add to that, and that is that the way this policy works, you also have to think of it systemically from a global point of view. And basically, in order to achieve the kind of employment stability that you're talking about in Germany, I mean, these policies, these mercantilist policies, are done for a reason. They do bring certain benefits. But it's important to understand it from a systemic point of view. What happens is that by reducing the household share of income in Germany, that's how they're able to run these surpluses. But that reduces German contribution to global demand. However, that doesn't affect the German economy directly, because as a result of these policies, Germany gets a bigger share of the rest of the world's demand. But the impact, and we've known this for a while, Keynes talked about this a great deal in the 30s and 40s, early 40s. The impact is that in this kind of trading system, there is a tendency for countries to compete in ways that reduce demand. So under these conditions, you have to see, in order for you to see growth, you have to see very rapid buildup in debt. And I think we would all agree that that's what we've been seeing in the last several decades. So there are two sets of problems with these policies. One is domestically. It has a tendency to increase income inequality domestically. And if you think that's a problem, then there's the problem. But perhaps more importantly, is that it has a tendency to put downward pressure on sustainable global growth. And so the world has to respond to that downward pressure by constantly increasing debt more quickly than we otherwise would. But yes, Germany does it for a reason. It believes that it benefits from it, just like China, just like Japan. But there is a cost to those benefits.
So this brings us as a very good segue to the United States. Germany and China are described in the book as systems that are creating huge trade surpluses. But then that raises the question of where do those surpluses go? And I think the book very elegantly shows that the United States becomes one of the main recipients of all that sort of excess saving in major export countries. And so that sounds like a positive thing. The United States is receiving all of this investment from China and from Europe. But actually, you show this a very sort of ominous development. Could you describe why sort of this investment from these export countries are actually distorting the U.S. economy? What the negative effects of that are, Michael?
Well, one of the things that we were very firm about in our book is our reluctance to unfortunately, a lot of the economics debate tends to be based on what I would call on matters of faith. So either you believe deficits are a bad thing, or you believe deficits are a good thing, or don't matter. And what we argue in this book is that's the wrong way to think about them. There are conditions under which deficits are good for growth, and there are conditions under which deficits are bad for growth. And what we really have to do is figure out what those conditions are. And it turns out they're not very complicated. As you know, the US ran deficits during most of the 19th century. I think 90 to 95 years of the 19th century, we ran deficits. Now, was that a problem? Well, a deficit by definition is equal to the excess of investment over savings. Countries with deficits have more investment than savings. That's true by definition. Now, what really matters is whether that deficit results in higher investment or in lower savings, because there's two ways you can get more investment than savings. One is by increasing investment, and the other is by reducing savings. And in the 19th century, when the US was a rapidly growing developing country, and it had very low savings, income was very well distributed in the US, US investment needs were constrained by the lack of domestic savings. In that case, when foreigners exported their excess savings, mostly the British, the French, and the Dutch, exported their excess savings into the US, that caused investment to go up. But what we argue in our book is that hasn't been true since the 1970s or 1980s. In the last several decades, we've lived in a world in which there is no savings constraint. There is an enormous amount of savings, too much savings. The cost of capital is extremely low. If you look at American companies, they're sitting on huge piles of cash, and they're not investing it. They call investing buying back shares, but that's just rearranging your savings. Investing means building factories or research facilities or distribution facilities, and that's not what they're doing with it. So what we argue is when foreigners export savings to the US, that doesn't cause investment to go up because there's no savings constraint. So by definition, it must cause savings to go down. There's simply no way around that. If investment doesn't go up, savings must go down. And how does savings go down? Well, there are several ways it can happen. One way is through an increase in unemployment. Another way is through an increase in household debt. And there's several reasons why household debt might go up. Yet another way is through an increase in the fiscal deficit. But basically, they all come down to three things. Either unemployment goes up, or household debt goes up, or the fiscal deficit goes up. And usually what happens is either the Fed accommodates a rise in household debt, or the government expands the fiscal deficit. We generally don't get the increase in unemployment. But the point is that all three of those things are things that we don't want, that the US wouldn't want. If it were a developing country, foreign inflows would be great. But as an advanced economy, foreign inflows force the US to choose between higher unemployment or higher debt, and we have no choice. And I'll just say one last thing before passing it on to Matt. But when we spoke to Adam Tooze about this book, one of the thing that he said was most shocking, he thought, was our argument that the US cannot control its savings rate. And the way we put it is many people argue that the US runs a current account deficit because it saves too little. No, we argue the US must save too little because it runs a current account deficit. And it runs a current account deficit because it's the sink of excess savings for the world.
So maybe another way of putting, saying the same thing, but just to sort of highlight this is that if U.S. businesses and workers were running at full tilt, and there was absolutely, you were like, kind of like think of like World War II level mobilization, and at that point, people wanted more stuff. There was absolutely no spare capacity in the United States. Then it would be very helpful to be able to pull in imports from the rest of the world and have if other societies were for some reason consuming less than they're producing. But that's not the world that we live in the United States. It's not the world we've lived in the United States for a very, very long time. And so in that context, if other societies are, and their businesses are producing more than they're consuming and essentially, dumping it, if you will, then that would have to necessarily come at the cost of displacing production that's already would otherwise exist in the United States, and that's why it's negative. And so the question is, what are the circumstances? And as Michael was saying, if you're in a developing country, if you're from a poor society, then it's very helpful to be able to get foreign investment and to borrow from abroad. If you're not, then it's a very different set of dynamics.
Yeah, so I think this is a compelling sketch of a system that is pathological in some ways, but strangely, but also strangely, yeah, having reached a weird equilibrium that doesn't work necessarily for most of the people in most of these countries. There are countries like Germany and China that are not being where most of the people are not seeing their living standards rise commensurate with their productivity, and are lacking investment at home. And then there are countries like the United States receiving foreign investment that is also not being used productively and is creating kinds of debts that are not productive. I wonder, in the past year since you wrote the book, whether there have been changes, whether there have been during the pandemic and the political responses to it, indications that this system that you described is shifting at all. I think, I guess, of a few things. First, obviously, the Biden administration is talking about huge spending programs that may be redirecting that foreign money maybe to more productive public uses. And then when I think of China, I think of discussion of how there may be shifting to greater investments in terms of renewable energy, climate change investments, these very, very ambitious climate targets. Is that a kind of productive investment that can be done at home that may actually provide some major shift? Or are there other shifts in the past year that you want to identify? And before you answer, I also want to say, the audience, we'll go to the audience questions next. If you have questions, obviously, again, you can do that on Zoom or email. But otherwise, yeah, I'm curious, this past year of the pandemic, has that has that shifted things in the system you described? Either one of you could start. Matthew,
Matt, you want to start?
Sure. So this is something I've definitely spent some time looking at the day job at Barron's, and the answer is, in some ways, there have been some significant changes. In some ways, it's sort of exacerbated the tendencies we talked about before. So, as you mentioned, the United States has really, once again become the world's consumer, source of global demand of last resort in a really extreme way. And in particular, the most recent, both with the context of CARES Act, and then with the package that was passed at the end of December, and then again with the American Rescue Plan, all this stuff, there's been such an outsized response by the federal government in terms of giving consumers money, supporting continued spending by Americans despite the pandemic, despite business failures, and despite a relatively mediocre public health response. That's actually been very helpful to the rest of the world. And so what you've seen kind of unusually is that, unlike most countries where imports have gone down, because global demand has fallen. Actually, in the U.S., imports, as of now, are slightly higher than they were before the pandemic, and imports of goods are much higher. So imports of services are down because there's less tourism and things like that. But imports of goods are up, so overall imports have actually fully recovered in the United States. On the other hand, because the rest of the world hasn't done this, or at least certainly hasn't done it to the same extent, exports from the U.S. are much lower. And so that's, of course, led to a significant increase in the trade deficit. And in fact, one of the things that the OECD recently did some analysis of the American Rescue Plan. I think it was either right before or right after it was passed, and basically saying the impact of this is going to be a massive boost to global growth. That all of America's trade partners are going to benefit pretty tremendously. But of course, the consequence is going to be the U.S. trade deficit is going to widen a lot. And of course, we're already seeing that, and it's probably going to continue to happen as a consequence as people who got that money start spending it on goods, some of which are produced in the U.S., some of which are not. In China, we had a very different dynamic. One of the things that's really striking is that even though the public health situation in China was handled better, at least after the first couple months, that overall consumer spending in China fell in 2020 relative to 2019, whereas in the U.S. it was the reverse, which is kind of striking, especially considering that the Chinese economy as a whole grew when the U.S. economy as a whole fell. And so that Michael will get into the reasons what happened, but it really reflects a lot of sort of the pre-existing stuff and the dynamics that we were talking about in the book. The one thing I think that's really interesting and potentially could be changing is the situation in Europe, where the initial response of the pandemic. Well, first of all, the German government actually kind of unusually did respond very aggressively in supporting households and businesses, and at a scale initially comparable to actually what the U.S. did. Since the U.S. since did subsequent things that the German government has not, but that initial package was actually quite large. And the other thing is that you had that Franco-German proposal for having the EU borrow as a whole to then spend money and distribute it to all of Europe. That was quickly supported, and that led to the recovery fund. Now, the size of the recovery fund is relatively small, and they still haven't distributed the money, and who knows when that's actually going to get put out. But I mean, the fact that you actually are seeing this sort of potential shift towards greater level of federalism and sort of coherence at the European level of Europeans borrowing as a whole to support Europe as a whole, as opposed to sort of thinking narrowly of themselves as nation states, that could be very constructive and could be a positive development in terms of what we're talking about. I mean, it might be too early to tell, but that's I think potentially a really interesting change.
And Michael, briefly, is there any changes in China in the past year or so, in terms of the political economy, that suggests there's something changing, any more productive investment happening there that may actually provide a meaningful shift, or is it essentially unchanged?
Well, there's a lot of talk about that, Cameron, but we've been talking about this basically since 2007. Now, what typically happens historically, it seems to me, let me start by saying the Chinese growth model is not particularly Chinese. It's a growth model that many countries have followed before. I call it the investment-driven growth model. And China has just taken it to more extreme levels than any other country has. But in every case, you get very rapid, healthy growth in the initial stages. And then at some point, you start seeing very, very rapid growth in the debt burden. And what that tells you is that this investment is no longer productive. For some reason, a lot of economists don't understand this, but basically, if you borrow $100 and invest it in a project that's worth $110, your debt goes up by $100, but your debt burden actually goes down. Chinese debt has been rising very rapidly since the late 1980s, but we never really noticed it because China's GDP was rising just as quickly until basically in the first decade of this century. And then we started to see explosive growth in the debt burden, which should have told us right off the bat that that must be because the investment was no longer generating as much economic growth as the increase in debt. And it took a few years to understand the problem, but I think now it's widely recognized that China has an investment problem. And what happened in China and what typically happens in most countries that go through this problem is that the very first proposed solution is the way to solve this is not to stop investing. The way to solve this is to shift out of non-productive investment into productive investment. Once we do that, the problem's over. And that's absolutely true. But it's a little bit akin to saying, the way to guarantee your son or your daughter's future is to have him or her win the lottery. And in that case, you don't need to go to college. Your future is assured. Of course, it's true. It's just damned hard to do that. And in the case of China, you've got massive amounts of investment into concrete, basically into wheelbarrows and concrete. And so there's talk about shifting that into the high-tech sector, which is a tiny share of the Chinese economy. So you would have to, quintuple high-tech investment just for it to be meaningful. And they talk about the green part of the economy, et cetera. But we're really talking massive shifts of investment. And so far, they've been unable to do that. And frankly, I don't think they will be able to do that. So what China has come up with is something called dual circulation, which is just the old rebalancing from 2007 under a different name. And what they've said is what we need to do is to boost domestic consumption, and that's absolutely correct. But as Matt and I point out in our book, boosting consumption is pretty straightforward. It means boosting the income share of ordinary households. And that's really difficult to do because that's politically very tough. If I boost your share, I've got to reduce someone else's share. And of course, that's always the hard part. So the big change that's taken place in China is not so much a change. It's an acceleration of the existing problems. Debt is rising faster than ever. Exports are growing, imports are shrinking. Consumption, as Matt said, is actually down while investment is up. So there's a greater recognition of the need to rebalance the economy. But I'm a little bit pessimistic because I haven't seen any real change in the policies aimed at rebalancing the economy.
Okay, that is a bracing summary. We have a lot of questions from the audience, so I'd like to shift to those. First, from Aston in Canberra, Australia. He asks, what do you think Biden should do in response to China's move to challenge the status of the US dollar, especially their move towards digital yuan? That reminds me how in the book you refer to the status of the US dollar as a reserve currency as a exorbitant burden, as you put it. So is this actually something that the United States should welcome, a sort of a reduction in its status as a leading currency? Is that something that the United States should respond to somehow and positively?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the short answer would be the U.S. should do nothing. But Michael probably has more thoughts on, what specifically the impact of China's central bank, proposed digital yuan would be. So I'm curious to.
Well, I think nothing. What's really impressive about the renminbi is not how important it's become, but rather how incredibly unimportant it is given the size of the Chinese economy. If you take the top 10 trade currencies in the world and you divide them, you normalize them somehow, divide them by their share of global GDP or divide them by their share of global trade, whatever you like, what you'll see is that 9 of those currencies punch way above their weight. In other words, the ratio of their share of global GDP to their share of global currency usage is above 1. It ranges from 2 to all the way up to 6 or 7. The highest typically being New Zealand, not because it's so actively used, but because it's such a tiny economy. So of course, it's much more likely to be an outlier. If you look at China, China is the only one that's below 1, and it's way below 1. It's about 0.16, something like that. So really, when you look at the use of the renminbi, what's really astonishing is how unimportant it is, not how important it is. And it's unimportant for a very good reason. For all of the talk that you hear in China about how they want the renminbi to become a major global currency, basically the policy has been, we want the benefits of a global currency, the geopolitical benefits of a global currency, but we are not willing to accept any of the economic costs of doing so. And what Matt and I argue in our book is that there is an enormous cost to the US of the use of the dollar, economic costs. There are clearly geopolitical benefits, but there's a huge economic cost to the US of the use of the dollar as the dominant reserve currency. And I've long argued that, yes, I think in the next 10 or 15 years, the dollar will stop becoming the dominant reserve currency, not because it's replaced by the renminbi or by the euro, but because the US itself takes steps to end that process, either with a currency like Bancor or SDRs, or simply by unilaterally restricting foreign capital inflows.
So I'll take a few more questions here. On that end, it would be great if the authors could be a bit pithy with the answers, maybe just so we can fit in a few more questions in our time, in our allotted time. So we have a question from Michael Camunez, who's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for International Trade under the Obama administration. He says, this has been an interesting conversation, but could you ground this a bit more in actual U.S. domestic policy? I fear a more protectionist mindset is taking root in the United States and globally. What pragmatic advice do you have for the U.S. government to promote growth in the working class and reduce income inequality without compromising a commitment to free trade? So is there pragmatic ideas for promoting growth among the U.S. working class? What should the U.S. government be doing in practice here?
So this is something we touch on. So this is something we touch on at the end of the book, and basically there's sort of a trade-off you're going to have inevitably, which is that, as part of a global system, the U.S. has only so much choice of being able to affect the global economy as a whole. But to the extent that the government can offset the impact of what other societies are doing in terms of their own underconsumption, underinvestment, and the extent that the U.S. government can support U.S. domestic demand and U.S. employment by spending more at home and ensuring that U.S. workers have sufficient incomes and that supports jobs in the United States. Those things are worth doing, and the extent that the U.S. government can also reduce some, or reduce the fears of some other governments that they won't be able to buy things that lead to reserve accumulation. So, for example, increasing the generosity of, say, Federal Reserve swap lines, or making IMF less punitive when it makes emergency loans, that would also be helpful. I mean, the goal overall is how can you increase global demand enough and ensure that enough of that demand affects U.S. businesses, that U.S. employment is still high and U.S. incomes are still high. That's really the problem that an American policymaker would have to face. Ideally, also, you could have, you talk to people in other countries and try to get them to fix their own domestic problems. But failing that, that seems like the big thing. And then, as Michael was saying, the extent that you can sort of prevent unwanted inflows into your financial system and distort things, whether it's some sort of capital inflow tax or some other measure, that could also be helpful as well. But ultimately, there's only so much that you can do as one part of, smaller part of a global system without changes elsewhere.
Yes, I can't help but jump in, Cameron. But in response to Michael's question, there isn't really a problem with trade. The way imbalances are distributed are through the capital account. So I would argue that the U.S. shouldn't intervene in trade. It shouldn't even pressure U.S. companies to stop offshoring. That's not the problem. The problem is that excess savings are absorbed by the US through the capital account, and it's on the capital account that we should be focusing, not the trade account. We should let trade free.
Well, that leads to maybe the next question, which is from Wei Liang. She writes, it seems that the that there is US-China economic decoupling and increasing trade regionalism and trade with like-minded groups. How would you forecast international trade in the coming decade? Will we return to the principle of embedded liberalism or a new economic Cold War? So it's obviously a very broad question to forecast the coming decade, but do you see the things that you are recommending, even if it comes to the kind of changes in the capital accounts, capital flows, is anyone talking about these things in earnest? Do you have a sense that there's changes underway, or do you think how do you see trade? How do you see this system developing in the coming years? And then this would be the last question before we wrap up. So yeah, if you could both weigh in on how you see the trade developing in the coming decade.
Well, I guess one thing I would say, yeah, sure. I guess one thing I would say is that in the case of China in particular, decoupling and deglobalization, whatever term you want to use, has actually been going on for probably a little over 10 years in terms of trade has become less and less important to the Chinese economy, with both exports and imports not shrinking in absolute terms, but relative to the size of domestic economy shrinking quite rapidly. And so, you can see that as a consequence, and as part of that sort of deliberate government policy. Part of it might be something else, but either way, from the Chinese perspective, trade is becoming much less important, and in the U.S. perspective as well, trade has sort of been, as a whole, not necessarily with China per se, but as a whole, has been sort of not any more important now than it was, say, 10 or 15 years ago. So in that sense, the sort of process of deglobalization, or if you want, is sort of, or at least the peak of globalization seeming to have peaked, has sort of maybe already happened in that sense, and sort of been going on for a little while. What goes on going forward, I think there's a lot of sort of, I think, geopolitical dynamics between U.S. and China that are sort of separate from sort of a straightforward economics conversation that might affect, some of these questions, and that at least, I think are a little bit outside of my own area, but that's probably could also be, a factor as well for thinking about sort of the next 10 years.
Michael?
I would add to that to the extent we're taking inequality seriously as a problem, and we should be taking it very seriously as a problem, not just socially and politically, but it's also a very big economic problem. We have almost no choice but to reverse some of what Danny Roderick called hyperglobalization. In fact, Roderick, about 10 years ago, wrote a really, I think, very important essay in which he argued that in this hyper-globalized world, in this world which basically I define as one with very low frictional transportation and communication costs, he said countries, particularly democracies, had to choose between more global integration or more control of their domestic economies. They couldn't get both. They got one or the other. At the time, he thought the world was moving towards more global integration, but he quickly came to realize, and I think, Trump has been part of this, what we've seen in Europe has been part of this, what we've seen in China has been part of this. There is this recognition that there's only so much we're willing to give up in terms of domestic control of the economy. So I've been pretty pessimistic since at least my 2013 book on the prospects for global trade. I think we are in one of those periods of a retreat in globalization. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. What really matters is how we do it, and how we sort of set ourselves up for the next stage of an increase in global trade. That's a little vague, but it's hard to get more specific.
Well, I think it's a somewhat gloomy prediction, but I think ultimately, probably, as you say, necessary changes will happen, regardless if they happen the right way, the way we want, or they'll happen in ways that we don't want. So unfortunately, we do have to wrap up here. It has been a fascinating conversation. I think everyone would agree. congratulations again to the winners, Matthew Klein and Michael Pettis.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For winning this year's Gelber Prize, and again a special thanks to the Gelber Prize and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto for partnering with us on this dialogue, and more generally helping explore new and interesting ideas on international affairs. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you all tune in again next year when we unveil next year's prize. So thanks again, and congratulations.
Thanks very much, Cameron.